Welcome to toy-polloi.
Hello and welcome to another video from toy-polloi. Today we're going to be looking at the new Star Wars Retro collection figures produced by Hasbro, or Kenner as it says on the packets here, but these are produced by Hasbro. They've done one wave so far which contains 6 figures. Those include Chewbacca, Stormtrooper, Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Darth Vader and Han Solo. And these have only just started turning up here in the UK. They've been available in the States for a little while, but it really has taken quite some time for them to appear here. And they're not that easy to get still. Now, I had to go to a couple of Asda stores to find these, and the larger Asda store that I went to, they did have all 6 of them in one go, but these were the only ones that they had, and they were just sort of jammed in the back of a display, not really even on display, just sort of piled up face down. So I was very lucky to find them. They're on sale for $9.97 each, and I did manage to get all 6, as you can see. So let's crack straight on with the review, and I'll give you a full rundown of what the figures are like. We'll take them out the packets and see what they are like in hand. So if we take a look at the Han Solo figure, you can see they come on a retro style card. I have to say I'm not actually that sort of in love with these cards. I think they are a bit rubbish, and I'll give you sort of all the reasons why. Overall, you know, from a sort of display point of view, they look sort of kind of okay, but as you get sort of closer into them, the bits that I don't like become more and more apparent. First up is going to be this sort of faux aging that they put around the edge of it to make it look like a sort of battered card. I really think that is quite rubbish, and because they've used exactly the same sort of faux aging on every card, when you have a few of these lined up together, you can clearly see this is the same sort of aging put on each one. It just looks a little bit on the cheap side. And also, I don't like this big sticker, but it is a sticker, so you can remove that. So I will be showing you how to remove that in a separate video. Now, for the European releases of these figures, they've also added another thing which I really don't like, and it's that big sort of pamphlet leaflet behind the figure. Now, this contains all the sort of legal mumbo jumbo that you have to put with toys here in sort of the European Union. If you look at a US version of it, this is Tarkin from the US, you can see it doesn't have that sort of leaflet stuck behind the figure. So actually that figure would display quite reasonably if you took the sticker off it. This one, because you've got this big leaflet behind, it just looks a bit awful. So I think I'm going to be removing those as well. In my video where I show how to remove the sticker, I'll also show how to remove that leaflet, because that would look much better without that and that. Now if we turn the card over, you can see there's a lot of sort of, again, legal sort of stuff on the back and warnings and that. Again, this varies from the US to the UK card, or the European card. So this is the European card, lots of bump on the back, lots of warnings written in multiple languages. If we look at the US card, that has been cut down quite substantially. There's just 3 sort of warnings there, but then it still takes up exactly the same space. We've got a little bit of information at the top, but not really anything of any worth. So the main point of this card is going to be the front, and that is how most people will want to display it. The images on the front are actually quite nice. These are similar to the ones used on the original vintage cards, and the print quality is quite nice, although I do think the actual card stock they've used is really quite thin and weedy. So here we have the Han Solo card. Pretty nice regular image. There is the Darth Vader one. Again, that's much like the original sort of vintage Star Wars card. Also have a look at Leia. Again, classic image. And I'm not going to show you all of them because, let's face it, you've seen these cards many times. They've got Chewbacca at the back, which is a nice picture of Chewbacca growling. A couple of Stormtroopers on the Stormtrooper card, and Luke there looking out at the sunset on Tatooine. So overall, I'd say the packaging is okay. Just a few sort of letdowns on it. All the legal mumbo jumbo really does ruin these figures. And there's one other slight difference between the cards from sort of European and US. You can see here that on the US they very clumsily added this choking hazard sort of print. Now this is actually printed onto the card, and they've just sort of half-heartedly stuck it over part of the Star Wars logo there, and I think that is pretty rubbish. So the European card is slightly better just because it doesn't have that on there. Although it has the massive pamphlet behind the figure, it doesn't actually have that bit sort of just arbitrarily stuck over the logo in the sort of top right hand corner. So really there's no perfect card. The European cards, bit rubbish, and the American cards again have their issues, but I suppose American cards win slightly over this. So let's open up all of these figures and we'll take a closer look at what they are, and we can compare them to some original figures and see how well they stand up. here they all are now released from their plastic tombs, and actually they look pretty good. When you sort of line them all up like this, they are a, sort of a nice sort of recreation of the vintage figures. There are some really obvious flaws with them straight away. The main one being is that they barely hold their weapons. Leia's the only one I've actually managed to sort of get to hold a weapon. Chewbacca's is a different one because it clips onto his arm, but Leia barely holds a weapon. Han Solo won't hold his weapon, and neither will the Stormtrooper. Whatever they've done with the moulds, Hasbro has sort of made a massive error in the fact that, you know, they come with weapons, they should be able to hold their weapons, and those ones barely do. If we take Han Solo for an example here, we can get his blaster. I can try and clip that in his hand like you would normally. So we clip that in his hand. Oh dear, it falls out. There is absolutely no way to get that to stay in his hand. I've tried multiple times, multiple sort of ways of just bending his fingers. Whatever they've done to the moulds, they have shrunk slightly, and so even holding a weapon, which is the main job of Han Solo, he doesn't do it. And the Stormtrooper is exactly the same. If I bring that in here, you can see actually the Stormtrooper figure looks pretty nice, but as soon as you give him a weapon, just slot that in. This is the weapon that came with him. It doesn't stay. There's just not enough grip in that hand. You can sort of try and bend the fingers, but it really just doesn't want to stay. So I'm going to say straight away, Hasbro has sort of let the quality assurance sort of fail yet again, which is something they've been doing for years now. The qualities of these figures, doing the basic thing of holding the weapon, is terrible, and so that is the first fail on these figures. But, you know, overall they look nice, and I think that's the main thing they're going for. They're wanting things that look nice in the packaging. If we take Darth Vader here, I think he's probably the best of the bunch of these figures, and there's really not much you could do wrong on this figure. It's, you know, essentially a black figure with a tiny amount of detailing printed on his chest, and they've managed to do that. They've used a silver paint instead of a white paint. If I bring in my original Darth Vader here, you can see he has white and red paint, and all the vintage Darth Vaders I have white and red paint, but this they have used silver paint and then put red over the top of it. The figure is actually pretty good. I think the mouldings that they've used, or the castings, they've lost some of the fine detail. It's certainly not as sort of crisp as this original one, but it's not too bad. The material they've used for the cape, again, is pretty good. There's a slight difference to the vintage one, but it is as close as you can get. And the lightsaber works. Again, that sort of matches. I don't think that's even an original lightsaber. It might be, I can't remember. Bit sort of not quite as orange, but it works, you know, and it fits the arm nicely, and it does slide in and out. So Darth Vader is one of the better figures. I think that is really quite nice. Let's move on to the Stormtrooper. So here is the modern Stormtrooper. It's made of a really white plastic, and it really is quite a crisp white. You can see that they have changed details on all of these figures. The copyright information on the back has changed. It just says LFL Hasbro China, so there's no year on it, and we've got this extra bit of sort of labelling, which is just a sort of number with a hash code next to it. So it is quite clear that this is a modern version of the figure. The plastic is just a little bit too white. Still got a bit of bend in the legs. As I say, the flaw is that he won't hold his weapon, so that's very disappointing. Imagine if I'm going to put this in my Stormtrooper army, he just can't hold a weapon. And they've also changed the way the hands are done. On the original figures, there's just a bit of black paint put on the fingers, but on these, they've actually painted the hands black and then put white paint on the back of it to add this detailing. So fairly sort of subtle difference, but it shows that they've changed the way they paint them. You can see as a comparison, does actually look pretty close to an original Stormtrooper. The detailing, as I say, is a little bit softer, so it looks like they've cast off an old figure and made new moulds from that. So it's not quite a sort of perfect match, but it really isn't too bad otherwise. If he held his gun, that would be a really nice figure, but he doesn't. Now we move on to Luke, and Luke is one that, I don't know, I'm not particularly happy with. Something about it doesn't sort of feel right. It's the same sculpt near enough. You can see that they have just sort of taken a casting of the old figure, but the way they've applied the face, I just don't like those eyes and eyebrows. Doesn't look quite right. The plastic, again, just doesn't feel quite right. It's really white, and also the original has a slight sort of softness to it, and I don't think that's a good match. But, you know, maybe they're not trying to sort of recreate these perfectly. The other thing they've changed, or the main thing they've changed, is on all of the vintage Lukes I've got, they are white legs with the boots painted on, but on this modern sort of reproduction that Hasbro have done, it is brown plastic they've used on the legs, and then the top part of the leg has been painted white. I can see why they would have changed that, because obviously it's a lot less paint to use, and obviously on all of these vintage figures the boots chip and the paint chips off, so it's very hard to find an original one without sort of paint chipping on the leg. But on this, that should sort of not happen, because the boots are plastic and won't chip. You'll just get some chips up here around the groin area, but that, you know, that's a sort of minor change. Again, the lightsaber does work quite nicely on this. It goes in and out. It's just something about this figure I don't like. It just doesn't look quite right. It doesn't feel quite right, and the look of the face I'm finding a little bit off-putting, but it's not so bad. Now, I've already shown you Han Solo because he doesn't hold his weapon. The figure itself, again, a little bit soft on the mould. If I compare it to my original one here, you can see that there's much more detailing around the sort of the shirt and that, and on this modern one, that's all gone. It's gone very soft. And likewise, the head is thinner as well, and I think that's something to do with how they've moulded them, because certainly these look a little bit thin all over, and that's why he won't hold his gun. But he's still got all the detailing. He's got a nice sort of red line down the sides of his legs. His feet are also a tad smaller. Again, I think that's the mould shrinking. I would have much preferred it if they had made it with the small head Han Solo. I just think that is a nicer head. You can see here that that's just a nicer sort of version, nicer sculpt, but they've gone with the big head Han Solo. Again, it's okay. This is not the worst one. I think it's passable. If they'd made it hold his gun, it would have been great, but as he doesn't hold his gun, that is a massive flaw on that. Then we come to Leia, and again, this has the problem that the Stormtrooper and Han has, that she barely holds her gun. You can see I just about managed to wedge that in there, but if you move it ever so slightly, the gun falls out. So again, they've done something with the mould on this. This figure is pretty nice. It is absolutely minty white. I don't think I've ever seen even an original Leia that white. I'll bring in my loose Leia. You can see she's a bit yellowed with age, but this one is absolutely minty white. Again, detailing on this one is not too bad. They've managed to get most of the detailing across, and the face sculpt is still working quite nicely. They've made the hair a slightly darker colour. You can see the original one is a little bit more brown, and this modern reproduction is a little bit darker. But overall, it's actually a pretty good sort of recreation of it. On the original Leia here, you can see on her belt, they've actually painted those two white sort of buttons, I suppose they are, onto the belt. And on this one, all they've done is not painted it, so that is actually sort of the plastic rather than a paint application, so a slight change there. Again, the cape is a really good match to the original one. Nice sort of feel to it. She has the same sort of markings on her legs as all the other figures do, so it's not the same copyright information on the back. If they just made it that she could hold her gun, that would have been a great figure, but as you can see, the fact that it's barely held in her hands is a real problem. And finally we come on to Chewbacca. Again, this figure is actually a pretty good one, and there's very little they could do wrong with it, because it doesn't have a great sort of paint scheme or anything like that. There's a little bit of paint applied to it, and the gun, because it is held further up his arm, actually holds in place. So if they have sort of shrunken the moulds, it doesn't matter, because it's held on further up the arm. For some reason this one is particularly shiny. It might be just I was unlucky. I had no choice in these figures. I just picked up what was on the shelf. But you can see he is particularly shiny. If I bring in one of my vintage Chewbaccas, see that's a lot duller, and just doesn't have the shine to it. That might just be how this one has been produced. If I find another one, I might pick it up just to do sort of comparison. But overall, I actually think Chewbacca is a sort of a very nice recreation of the vintage figures. That one they've done a very good job on. Much like Darth Vader, I think there's very little they would have been able to mess up on this, because it's a minimal paint scheme anyway, and the figure sort of is all about the sculpt. So I think that one does a pretty good job of it. And my favourite two certainly are Darth Vader and Chewbacca. The weapons that come with the figures are actually pretty reasonable. They've done a very good job of recreating these. The plastic certainly feels sort of much like the originals. It's got a little bit of flex to them, and I can't see any obvious markings on any of them that they sort of mark them out as being different. None of these have any numbers or anything sort of particular on them. They sort of look pretty reasonable. In fact, I would be happy to have any of these sort of with my vintage figures, and I don't think I would even notice that they weren't original. They certainly look the part and do the job, and these do actually fit in the original figures much better than they do in these modern reproductions. So here's my vintage Stormtrooper. Let's put the gun in. You can see that actually fits in his hand quite nicely. It's just a shame that they did mess up the hands on these vintage figures, so that they don't actually hold them properly. So let's bring in my vintage Han Solo, and we'll try this modern Han Solo blaster on it and see how well he holds it. It certainly initially clips in a lot better. And that's a remarkable difference to the modern one, which doesn't hold it at all. But you can see over time it now squeezes out and is sort of pushed away, because I think this weapon is going to be slightly larger than the vintage one. It just doesn't want to stay put. So I don't know what Hasbro are doing with these sort of figures and weapons, but the combination of the gun being slightly large and the hands being slightly small, I don't know, it doesn't work. So that is a vintage figure. It doesn't want to hold a weapon. I'll put the vintage weapon back in. I know that one holds because that's what's been on display. So let's bring in Han Solo again and see what he sort of works with here. So this is the modern Han Solo. We can squeeze that in. Yeah, the hand is too small and the gun is too large, certainly. Let's try it. I'm going to just grab a vintage weapon. So this is a vintage blaster. Let's put that in the modern figure. Do you know what? That works a lot better. So if you get these modern figures, get some modern blasters. I actually even think this might be a reproduction blaster that I picked up. So, you know, even a modern reproduction blaster will work better than the blasters that Hasbro give you in the packet. That's a little bit sad, isn't it? That modern reproductions work better than Hasbro's own blasters. So what can I say as a sort of sum up for these figures? I think overall they do look quite nice, but as with everything Hasbro produce, it is let down by their quality control. There's just something about modern figures that they just can't get quite right. The fact that these figures cannot hold the weapons that they come with is a real disappointment, and that really is something quite basic that Hasbro should have sort of worked on when making these figures. If you're going to give a figure with a weapon, make sure it can hold it. And as you can see here, I've now got 3 that can't hold the weapons, but what they can hold is modern reproduction weapons. So I'm actually just going to get some reproduction weapons and swap them out for these figures so that they can still hold their weapons. Just a terrible sort of mistake on Hasbro's part. Some things are nice though. I think Darth Vader is really good, and I think Chewbacca is really nice. Though out of the 6 figures, those are the ones that work really well and just sort of do everything that I would want them to do. They look like old figures, they move like old figures, they feel like old figures, and they can hold their weapons. The other 4 I'm less impressed with. Certainly Han and the Stormtrooper, I don't know, it just doesn't do it for me. And Luke, there's something up with his face that doesn't look quite right, so I'm just not that happy with it as a figure. I think the vintage sort of original one still looks much nicer, and I think that there are some people out there producing modern reproductions of figures that do a lot better job than Hasbro do. Their quality control on all of the toys that they produce at the moment is subpar, and it really lets them down. So it's a shame. They're nice figures, they're certainly worth picking up if you see them, but they could have been a lot better, and if Hasbro just put a little bit more effort in, they could have made some amazing figures. So if they do a wave 2 of this, I hope they take note of some of the things that are said about these and sort of up the production standards and try and get them just a little bit better. Because let's face it, these are only going to be bought by sort of older collectors who want to sort of relive some of their childhood memories. So they're going to want these to be as close to the originals as they possibly can. I need to say a massive thank you to Nick Filippelli, who very kindly sent me the Grand Moff Tarkin figure, which I've not reviewed here because this is only about the original 6 that have been produced by Hasbro, but I will review him in a future video. If you want to see how to remove the stickers and get the leaflet out of these card backs, then do check out my other video. If you've enjoyed this as well, make sure and hit the subscribe button to be notified each time I upload a new video, and thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching toy-polloi. Subscribe for more great videos. You can also follow toy-polloi on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.